In this video, I'm going to talk about how to get your exposure right. So when you're using a DSLR camera, you're always having to do a juggling act with your ISO, your aperture and your shutter speed to get the exposure correct. In this image you can see a section of different apertures in the camera. So what the aperture does is it opens your lens wider to let in more light. So you can see the top left figure, it's 1.8 on this particular lens. That's the widest setting, and then it gets narrower as you go down. So for the higher number, like if it was f11, like you can see there, it's much smaller the hole than it is for the f1.8, and it will let in a lot less light than the 1.8. In this image from the digitalcameraworld.com, it gives you an insight into what it's like inside the camera when you're taking the shutter. So you can see it's like blinds. You've got twin blinds. So the shutter mechanism, one drops down and to start the exposure, and the second follows to close the exposure, and it depends on how fast that moves and how much it lets in so much light. So the faster that moves, the less light it's going to let in. So I think this is a very good image from Digital Camera to show you the how the shutter works. I've downloaded this document from ISO.com, and it explains what ISO is. This is the document ISO in brief, and it's from the actual ISO website. So this is what ISO is. We are ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. So it is an independent non-governmental organization. It has global network of national standards bodies with one member per country. Our job is to make international standards. So in short, standards help make products compatible so they fit and work well with each other, identify safety issues of products and services, and share good ideas and solutions. So they're involved in lots of things, such as paper sizes, like the standards for paper sizes, like the A4 size, food safety, credit cards, codes for countries, currencies, and it's also standardizes the sensors on the camera lenses. So it standardizes the sensitivity of the sensor in the cameras. So if you start on 100 ISO, you're more or less guaranteed that you're not going to get any noise in your image. But if you go higher and higher and higher with each stop, the higher you go, the more noise you're going to get. So it's like a standardization, and it started off with the old films that they used to put in the cameras, and they used to have the ISO written on the film so you would know if it was going to be sensitive to light and things like that. But then once all the cameras became digital, well, most cameras became digital, they transferred the name ISO over to the sensors on the digital cameras. So it's like a standardization of the sensitivity to the light. That's why it's called ISO. In this image you can see I kept the aperture the same at 6.3, the ISO the same at 100. I changed the shutter speed from 1/10 of a second to 4/5 of a second to correct the exposure. So by changing the shutter speed you can change the exposure. In this experiment I just want to show you how I froze the frame, increasing the shutter speed. So I'm going to take an image of the the spinning top spinning with a slow shutter speed, and another image where I've had to increase the ISO so I was able to take a higher shutter speed to try and freeze the frame. So you can see from this image I've froze the frame at 1/2000th of a second, because a spinning top, this spinning top doesn't stand up straight if it's not spinning. So this was definitely spinning, and I was able to freeze it so you could see the detail on the spinning top. But the image is very noisy. You can see it looks like it's got speckles of dust all over it. That's the noise in the image, and that noise is caused by the ISO being 6400. The aperture was open at its widest setting at 2.8. And if you have a look at the second image, you can see that it's a much cleaner image, and the spinning top is blurred. I caught it at 1/4 of a second. The ISO was 100, so that's why it's clean, and same aperture. So to capture the blurred image, I needed a slow shutter speed, and 1/4 of a second is a slow shutter speed. But to freeze the frame, I needed a much higher shutter speed. I could have had a much cleaner image and froze the frame easier using a flash. I'll go into more detail about using a flash in another video. This image was taken at 1/200th of a second, which is a fairly fast shutter speed. It was able to freeze frame the water coming down the waterfall, as you can see there. So the next image, this was taken over 1 second. So obviously I had the camera on a tripod, and I set it to 1 second, and it was able to create the waterfall as a blurred effect, which a lot of people prefer with waterfall imagery. This image was taken of the red arrows in flight at 1/2000th of a second. I wish I'd had it faster, because it is slightly blurred looking at those aeroplanes. If I'd had it even faster, like if I'd gone to the limit on the camera, I might have had a sharper image with those aeroplanes. This image was taken at a fairground. So the first image was taken at 2/5 of a second. The second image was taken at 1 second, and you can see there's some blur in there. And the third image was taken over 2 seconds, so you can see there is a lot of blur there. To capture these fireworks, I had it on the widest aperture at 2.8, and I had it at 1/20th of a second, which is a fairly slow shutter speed, and the ISO had increased to 400. So in this image I was able to freeze frame the fruit falling into some water with a flash. It was on f14 aperture, 200th of a second, and I had to increase the ISO to 200 in this image. Let us take shutter speed. This is just to show you the different stops. So these are the stops in a third stops, and these are the stops in half stops. Now every camera is different. Some cameras don't let you change what size stops you want. Some cameras have more choice. They might have full stops, for example. So if we just have a look at this different stops, so that in third stops you've got 30 seconds, 25 seconds, 20 seconds, 15 seconds, going all the way down to 1/8000th of a second. And if you've got it in half stops, it starts with 30 seconds and it goes down to 1/8000th of a second. But you can see there's less stops if you're using half stops. So you can balance it more accurately with the third stops, but if you don't like winding through all of those different stops, you might prefer to have it on half stops. So to set the shutter speed in your camera, I did show you this in the videos on how to operate the DSLR and the settings, but as a reminder, you turn this button here to change your shutter speed. If you listen to the click, every time it clicks you're moving one stop, and you can see your shutter speed in that dial as well. You can see it changing when you move your dial, and you can see it on the back screen as well. So you can see the shutter speed here changing every time I move the dial. So the maximum shutter speed you can have with the dial, you can go right down to 30 seconds. So when would you take an image for over 30 seconds? Like the stars, you might want to have like star trails, or if there was an aurora, you might want to use like a very long shutter speed for that. You might want to do, say, have blurry people or blurry traffic. If you want to blur an image, you would have it on a very long shutter speed. Or if you were in a very dark enclosure, the longer your shutters, you might need to balance it with a long shutter speed. So your shutter speed goes up in stops, so that's 30 seconds, 25 seconds, 20 seconds, 15 seconds, so it goes all the way up to parts of seconds. So that's if we get to here, that's a fifth of a second, a sixth of a second, 10th of a second, 15th of a second, 20th of a second, and 100th of a second. So for example, if you wanted to take a picture of a person, it's probably best to have it more than 100th of a second, because people move, you know, even if they're just sitting still, they might move their arm or they might blink or whatever. So it's best to have it, probably I would say, for a person who's still or just walking slowly, at least like 125th of a second. The higher the better, really. It depends on the light where you're taking the image and if you can get that high speed or not. So 200th of a second, like 400th of a second is for like somebody moving fast, like somebody running. You might be able to get them on 400th of a second. Like 800th of a second might be an animal like running. 1,000th of a second could be somebody like running fast or something moving fast. And then you can go to 2,000th of a second. You might be able to capture a bird in flight depending on how slow they were flying. For a bird, I would always try to like go between 3,200th and 4,000th of a second. Might be more than that depending on how fast they move their wings. This camera goes up to 1/8,000th of a second, which is a very fast shutter speed. So you should be able to capture most things with that shutter speed. But there's a problem, because the higher up you go with the shutter speed, the lower the light. It lets in much less light the higher your shutter speed. So if you need a high shutter speed, you might have to put it on the widest aperture, which is 2.8, or you might have to increase your ISO as well. So ISO preferably should be left around 100 so you don't get any noise. As soon as you start moving that ISO higher than 100, you do start to get some noise, and the higher you go, the more noise is in your image. It's a balancing act between getting the shutter frame you want, the shutter speed you want, the aperture you want, and trying to keep that as low as you can. So for example, if I was going to take an image, let's just pull this screen out so you can see what I'm doing. So you can see I've got those flowers in focus there, and I've got my aperture at 2.8, and I've got the shutter speed at 1/5 of a second. So 1/5 of a second, 2.8, and the ISO is 100. I can't take an image hand holding this camera at 1/5 of a second, because when you hand hold a camera you have some shake in your hand and it moves. So you need, if you're hand holding a camera, you need to have the shutter speed at least the length of your lens that you're using. So if you were using a telephoto lens and say you had it at its longest setting, so if you had it on 200mm lens at its longest setting at 200mm, then you would have to have it at least 200ths of a second for the image not to be blurry. Possibly more than that, maybe it's 250th of a second. So if you wanted to take an image, say indoors, and you had it at 250th of a second, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to get that to balance with the light without having to increase your ISO, because the image will be too dark unless you used a flash, that is. I've got this set at 17mm on this particular lens, although this lens goes up to 50. It's because the white lines on the 17. I'm only using the 17mm lens, so I need to have it at least a 17th of a second, but say a 20th of a second to be safe, or even a 30th of a second to be safe, that you're going to get it not blurry. Make sure you've got your anti-shake, the stabilizer on your lens as well, and if you're having to hand hold it, that is. If you have a look at these two images here, the first image I've got the aperture set at 2.8 and the exposure with the shutter at 1/6 of a second, and I've kept the ISO at 100. So you can see the chess pieces, the brown ones in the background, they are more blurred because, well, even the white ones in the background are blurred compared to the ones at the front. So the ones at the front are in focus because with the aperture only 2.8, it only focuses on the images at the front of your view, and it blurs the background with a 2.8 aperture. But if you wanted all of the chess pieces to be in focus, if you have a look at the second image, that's at aperture 18, but I've had to increase the seconds. It is on a tripod, the camera, so I was able to increase the seconds to 8 seconds to get the light right without increasing the ISO. And you can see now all of the chess pieces are in focus with the f18. This image was taken to show you the difference between using a low ISO and a high ISO. So the same, this clock was taken on the first image, same aperture f4, and the ISO was 100. It was 3/10 of a second, and I had to have it on a tripod to take this image to get it clean like that without any noise in the image. The second image, you can see it's very noisy, it's very speckly. I had it on f4, and I increased, to get this noise I had to deliberately increase the shutter speed. So I increased the shutter speed to 1/1600th of a second. That made the image darker, so then I had to increase the ISO, and you can see there that it is very noisy with the 16,000 ISO there. This image I took when I first started using the bridge camera back in 2013. It was when I was in Salzburg in Austria, and I wanted to get this image, a nighttime image, and I used the automatic setting, and you can see from the automatic setting it gave me the wrong setting, so I ended up with a blurred image that I wasn't very happy with. So my photography has come on leaps and bounds since 2013. One day I'll go back to Salzburg and I'll take a proper image of this scene. This nighttime image was taken of the Newcastle quayside. I managed to keep the ISO at 100. I used a tripod and I used it for and I put the shutter setting to 3 seconds and the aperture 3.2 to get this image. Thank you for watching this video about getting the exposure right for beginners. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you've learned something from it. So until the next video, bye for now.